Howdy, y'all. My name is Jammer. I'm the Fuzzy Gay History Enthusiast, and we are now onto our fourth podcast thus far. I've actually followed through and actually gone to four. I'm incredibly proud of myself. The first one, as you know, if you've been following these, was about Roger Crowley's book 1453, which was about the fall of Constantinople. Then we hopped backward a little bit into Thermopylae by Ernest Bradford, specifically about the Persian Wars between the Greeks and the Persians. And then we sort of hopped forward again to discuss Cleopatra the Seventh. Stacy Schiff's Cleopatra, A Life, which I talked about in the last podcast, is an amazing book, and I would definitely recommend it. This fourth book that we're going to talk about, though, is a little bit different because, unlike the last three books, which have been, how you say, solid histories, the fourth book I'm going to talk about, while it is most certainly a history, it tackles a little bit more of an abstract concept. It's a history of ideas. The book in question is Civic Ritual and Renaissance Venice by Edward Muir. And it's a very, very academic book. And I should probably say this now moving forward, as I do intend to keep doing these, keep posting these, and talking about it. It is my effort in these podcasts to talk about a wide variety of history books, not just necessarily, quote, popular histories. Because if we look at the last three books, whether it was 1453, which was a very well-written book and well-researched book, or whether it was Stacy Schiff's Cleopatra, which again was an incredibly well-written book and a very well-researched book, and likewise Ernest Bradford. While I did have some issues with his methodology and in terms of his sort of ultimate approach, all three of those books were great history books. But again, they all had a very, quote, popular tone to them. They're history books that are designed for a sort of mass readership, which is not necessarily a bad thing. I subscribe to the personal individual philosophy that history as a discourse, in fact, any discourse or exchange of ideas, works when there are more and more people reading and critiquing it. Again, you can have a beautiful, wonderful, incredible idea, but if it is not approachable, applicable, or accessible to anyone else, what have you ultimately done? But at the same time, we have to acknowledge again that there are people in the field who are doing incredible research, who are not always wanting to write a popular history book. In fact, they are writing specifically with intent to an academic audience. And there's nothing wrong with that. The entire structure of academia is about argument. And academic writing, while it is arguably one of my least favorite genres of writing, is absolutely essential. And especially in the field that we're talking about here. Again, I am not an authority in any field, or excuse me, I am not an authority here in terms of history. I'm a history enthusiast. I love history. I love talking about history, but I will never put myself forward as a straight historian themselves. I don't have a degree in it. I'm not doing research. But I am a reader, and I have had enough training in order to understand whether or not an individual has constructed a successful argument. And so I wanted to talk about Civic Ritual in Renaissance Venice because while Edward Muir's book is difficult at times, and I'm going to talk a lot about his methodology here in a bit, his book was really, really interesting and really relevant. I've noted before in previous podcasts that I am an unashamed fanboy of Blue from Overly Sarcastic Productions. The guy is just awesome and is one of the reasons why I've gotten back into history. And so, especially with the topic of Venice, he has a four-part History of Venice series, which I will absolutely post in the description section because I've watched them all about 10 times. They're amazing. But along with that, I am also an unashamed Assassin's Creed fan. And if you have ever played Assassin's Creed 2, you'll know pretty much the entire second half of that game is set in the Republic of Venice, otherwise known as La Serenissima de Repubblica de Venezia, which also, let me footnote this here, I do not speak Italian at all, so I promise you I'm going to butcher some of these names and concepts, but just recognize that going forward. But anyway, these two facts, sort of about my most recent interests, should hopefully provide a pivot to why I'm talking about Muir's book today. The topic of Venice has just been in my head a lot lately, and my little sister, who actually took a couple of graduate-level history courses, actually read Muir's book and recommended it to me after I mentioned that I've been interested in the history in the Republic of Venice. Now, I also said a minute ago that Muir's book is not so much a full history as it is so much a history of ideas. Again, if you look at his title, Civic Ritual in Renaissance Venice, he's not talking specifically about the history of Venice in terms of political movements, in terms of economic movements, in terms of cultural movements. Well, no, that last part is incorrect. He is looking at the culture of Venice, but he's looking at a very specific aspect of the Republic, of La Serenissima. The title of that, La Serenissima, means most serene republic. And that is an important distinction. If you ever get into the history of Venice, Venetians saw themselves as kind of, if not ordained by God, sort of destined for success because of particular customs, particular ideologies. Now, part of it was also because they stole the body of St. Mark, one of the writers of the Bible. But again, I would definitely recommend watching Blue's videos because he can give you a more in-depth historical narrative than what I'm going to do here. Muir's book is trying to understand, where did that idea come from? Why did Venice perceive themselves as the most serene republic? What justifies that perception? Because again, that is a very, not necessarily vain position, but it's a very dubious position for anyone to argue for. Then again, part of it is the fact that you had a single government which lasted literally over 1,000 years. That's longer than any single run-in government in human history. It surpasses Rome, it surpasses the Mongol empires, it surpasses just about any empire, in fact. And so the success of Venice is one that, from afar, sounds like a vain concept, but upon closer execution, it is entirely warranted. The timeline, or sort of established estimation of the lasting power of Venice, began in 697 CE and ended in 1797 with the Treaty of Campo Formio, which gets into Napoleon. But if you look at that time frame, that's about 1,100 years of a single functioning government occupying over a group of individuals. And during its time, the Republic of Venice established a thalassocracy. It's sort of a system where you are not concerned with territorial occupation. Instead, you master the seas and occupy small regions. Sort of, because Venice is located in the Mediterranean, they established a massive trade and military might over the Mediterranean Sea, with small commercial outlets scattered throughout the region. And that's ultimately the key to their success, and one of the reasons why they lasted as long as they did. But getting back to the book itself, Muir wants to understand, okay, we had this republic that lasted for so long. We had this incredible commercial might. We had this incredible ability to last as long as it did. What is the key to the success? And Muir's argument is ultimately that the citizens of Venice established a sort of cultural mindset or a sort of cultural paradigm in which they saw themselves as destined to be the most serene republic. They deserved to be the serene republic, and the way that that message, the way that that sort of ideology was established was through civic rituals that were combined into sort of religious rituals as well. Now, he talks about a great number of them. I'm going to just try to hit a couple of small points here, but I wanted to start off a little bit by sort of letting Muir set up his actual argument. He says on page 6 of the book, in numerous medieval and Renaissance examples, legal and constitutional precepts and precedents found expression in ceremony long before they were written down in formal codes, and Venice, it seems, was indeed no stranger to the habit of ceremonial law. Sixth, again, he's sort of laying out the arguments here, sort of in order 1, 2, 3, 4. Sixth, the historian of civic ritual investigates how ceremonies may reveal the citizen's own sense of their city's relations with the outside world, relations that the Venetians saw by and large in imperial terms. Now, he continues on by saying, in Venice, one finds that the legally defined social classes, the patrimonial family, age groups, and women, all shared varying degrees of ritual recognition that marked their place in the political and social organization of the city. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit back again about academic writing. I said before, I'm not a huge fan of it. But in terms of academic writing here, I think Muir demonstrates his proficiency in the topic. Now, Muir is the current Clarence L. V. Steig Professor in the Arts of Sciences and Professor of History and Italian at the Department of History in the Weinberg College, sometimes referred to as Northeastern University. He's written extensively about culture during the Italian Renaissance period. And Civic Ritual in Renaissance Venice, which was published in the year 1981, is still celebrated by a great number of historians as a massive achievement. Now, it doesn't mean that his argument hasn't been critiqued, and I've actually read a couple of academic book reviews that have some issues with Muir's approach, and I have some issues with Muir's approach as well. There are times I feel that he pushes a little too far off the center of his argument, and one of the largest issues with this book is the fact that if you are not proficient in Latin, French, and Italian, there are numerous passages where he writes in Latin, French, and Italian. And so you have to essentially be trilingual or quadrilingual. Words. It's not like I have a master's in English, right? Whatever the case, his approach is sometimes kind of flawed by the fact that he is expecting the reader to understand the references he's throwing out or to understand the language that he's employing. But for all my problems with that, what I can't deny is that Muir is very much taking a solid academic approach. This is my thesis. This is what I'm going to do to prove my thesis, and then here is my evidence to support my thesis, along with some general analysis. That's usually how academic prose works. And in terms of this approach, I think Muir is actually really successful. And if you look at sort of the tone of the passage I just read, again, he's laying out the point by point by point of his argument, so the reader will know exactly this is what I'm going to talk about, and this is what I'm going to talk about. But if I can then pull away from the academic analysis, which, thank you, and look at what he's actually doing, he's making a really interesting argument. It's ultimately through the establishment of this sort of cultural rhetoric that citizens of this republic gain a conception of themselves. They have an idea of themselves. And at first, I understand there might be somebody who would go, well, so what? What's the immediate real-world relevance of that? I mean, yes, La Serenissima was interesting as she lasted for 1,000 years, 1,100 years, but how does that impact me personally? What relevance does this have? Well, I would argue it has a tremendous amount of relevance. I mean, we're living, especially in today's society, in terms of a nationalistic society. If I can point to something personal here, every single one of these podcasts has been recorded in front of a goddamn American flag. I am a patriot. I love my country. Part of it's partly because I was born here, but it's also because the advantages that I've had personally in terms of freedom of expression, freedom of identity, just the ability to live my life and prosper in this country is nothing short of incredible. But if we look at an American society as just an example, or excuse me, United States society, again, there's lots of people in America, there's a North and South America, there's lots of people in it. In terms of the United States, there are rituals in this country that we go through that sort of help compartmentalize identity. Again, I would argue that the First Amendment is its own sort of, not civic ritual in the sense, but it's sort of a consciousness. Because I am a citizen of the United States, I can say what I want without fear of social, political, or economic reprisal. And that's an important ideology. I told y'all again and again and again, I just cannot say words for some reason. But that's just sort of a very soft example of what I'm trying to do to show you what Muir's doing. Muir's trying to argue that rituals help create identity. Give you another one. In the United States, you have the 4th of July, and being, from the South, specifically Texas, around the 4th of July, people buy a lot of fireworks. And so the ritual of 4th of July is you go out, you grab a blanket, and you watch people set off fireworks, or you grab some bottle rockets and, try to shoot each other with bottle rockets. Was I the only one who did that? Oh, jeez. Okay. Anyway, moving on. The point is it's a very soft ritual, but it's still a ritual nonetheless, and it helps connect us to this idea of our past, who we are, what we were, and then what is our possibility for the future. Now, Muir continues sort of looking at how Venice created and established this identity. And I said before, a lot of the rituals Muir discusses has a very solid religious bent to it. Again, this is Renaissance Italy. So even if Venice expresses an extraordinary amount of individual autonomy, they're still subject to the whims of the Catholic Church. Now again, this is still the Catholic Church. Even after the Great Schism, Venice would still remain a solidly Catholic nation. Now, Muir talks a little bit about this on page 16 of his book, as he says, according to 15th century Venice humanist Giovanni Cadiera, the cardinal virtues, faith, hope, and charity, underlay the republican virtues, so obedience to the state was metaphorically obedience to the will of God. Thus, in Venice's patriotism equaled piety. The Venetians' conception of themselves as a chosen people, in consequence, was always revealed in their attachment to certain sacred institutions. So, what Muir's trying to dig into here is this idea of no matter how political the rituals that Venetians would participate in, whether it was the marriage of the sea, the Feast of Marys, what have you, underneath all of these political and economic rituals, there was always a religious bent to it. It's difficult as an atheist, personally, to sort of dig into this, or I won't say not necessarily understand it. I did grow up in the Episcopal Church, but at the same time, there's this conception of themselves as Christians, but more importantly, as chosen Christians. And this is a narrative that pops up in history time and time and time again. Certain documents, certain rituals are performed by a people in order to gain a deeper conception of themselves. And so Muir's trying to understand that as these rituals are performed and as the Venetians are beginning to compartmentalize this ideology, they're also sort of creating a mood, not an aesthetic. What am I trying to say? There's a governing philosophy. And he continues this point later on the page when he says, belief in Venice as the chosen city and adherence to the historical institutions of the Republic enabled the Venetians to withstand the tremendous forces for change, including the temptations of millenarian enthusiasm that ravaged the rest of Italy during the late 15th and 16th centuries. Now, if you've never read anything about the Renaissance, it was a very interesting time, because of a word that he employed there in that quote, specifically millenarianism. If you've never heard of it, you probably know what it is. It's the feeling or the perception or the idea that the world is coming to an end. Especially, I don't know, I can't speak for the rest of the world, but specifically in America, there's this trend, or just, there's always just this figure that's always saying, the world is coming to an end. If you've ever read Alan Moore's Watchmen, you know Rorschach's character is always walking around with the end is near post. That's a character in our culture, in our society, but it speaks to the fact that millenarianism is this constant sort of undercurrent philosophy. There is always going to be people who think that the world is going to come to an end, but especially during the Renaissance, there was a more heightened perception of it. Now, millenarianism has never gone away. The fact that it exists as far back as the Renaissance is a deep testament to the fact that there's always going to be people who believe that. But in terms of the Renaissance, the philosophy, I'm not going to say is justified, but it's still interesting to observe because, again, don't forget, the Renaissance was just coming on the heels of the Black Plague, which had ravaged Europe and had essentially destroyed, if not an entire half of the population, that at least two-thirds. You had entire generations who had watched millions of people just die through a horrible, unspeakable disease. And so, given the fact that people were still living in a very religious atmosphere, this constant source of death, the shortened expectancy of life, and all of the sort of constant waves of disease, always created this feeling, or this sort of undercurrent, where there was a conception that the world was going to end. Especially if you observe or if you read anything with the rest of the actual peninsula of Italy, millenarian sentiment ran ravagedly out. Ravagedly. Words. Wow. What am I trying to say is, it was a very popular idea and it gathered a lot of support. So we're trying to sort of point in here is, because the Venetians created a conception of themselves as a chosen people, there was some aspect of that millenarianism which was allowed to be subdued. I'm not going to say it was allowed to be completely conquered, because, again, each human being is different. Each human being is going to have their own conception of reality. Each person is going to have their own conception of what the world is, what is their role in it, what have you. There's always going to be a millenarian sentiment. But Muir's trying to argue is that because the Venetians were able to craft this idea that they were somehow special, that they were superior, or at least that they were above what was happening to everyone else, they were able to work past it and move through it. And that's an important idea. Again, ideologies are concepts that it's easy to forget how powerful they are. Again, I pointed out to the fact that I'm a citizen of the United States. That is a very violent, militant culture, and it's also a very ego-driven culture. Again, because people compartmentalize themselves as citizens of the United States, they have certain expectations of what that identity means for them personally. And again, each person has a different conception of what the United States is, what it stands for, what have you. But sort of undercurrent throughout is this notion of freedom and individual willpower. It's something that's ingrained into you from living in this country, living in this culture. And no matter what your religion, what your race is, what have you, you're driven by that perception. And so Muir's trying to create this interesting idea in his book how, again, through civic and highly religious rituals, Venetians were able to sort of build themselves up as above the rest of their peers. It's a very abstract concept, and I feel like I'm repeating myself a lot, but the problem is it's just the case of it. Venetians thought themselves above the rest of their Italian peers, and given their success, even if you disagree with the final conclusion of Muir, he does have a pretty solid basis to demonstrate that even if his argument isn't entirely sound, there was some quality of Venice that was able to last. And as he points out on page 17, for the Venetians, liberty was a matter not of personal freedom, but rather of political independence from other powers. If you ever studied Renaissance Italy, it's a really interesting concept because, again, we're so used, at least in the 20th century, to the conception of Italy as a combined country. But that's still a very recent development. Even going so far as the early 1800s, Italy was a very divided nation. You had Norman holdings in the south, in the region of Sicily, in the very boot of Italy, and then you had essentially what you had in ancient Greece, where you had polises or little individual city-states operating autonomously and also sort of warring and fighting. The history of Italy is one almost of constant conflict, and then also as well as outside influence, because France regularly invaded it, not only during the Renaissance, but then also later. Again, Napoleon, who is only moderately more interesting than Julius Caesar, in my opinion, but whatever the case, Napoleon actually invaded it and ended the Republic of Venice. But what I was trying to do by bringing that in is that Venice was able to sort of constantly hold on to this idea of personal political independence from other people. And that's a very Italian quality to it, but it's also a highly unique quality, because while everyone else sort of managed their own affairs, Venice was able to create a sort of lasting success that rivaled any other city-state during the Renaissance. Now, I wanted to talk about one of the actual ceremonies, or one of the actual civic rituals that Muir talks about in this book, specifically something known as the marriage of the sea. Now, if you don't know anything about it, I'll make sure to post a link in the description section to the Wikipedia page for it, because I think they do a pretty good job of sort of setting up what the marriage of the sea is, what was its significance, and sort of what was its long-lasting power. And I just realized that people are probably going to be messaging me and texting me, what have you, so I need to make sure all my devices are turned down. Well, we can hope. Now, Muir describes each of the civic rituals that he discusses in his book in a lot of detail, and I'm not going to give you quote after quote after quote after quote, because I did want to try to make this podcast a little bit shorter. An hour, I think, is a little bit too long for most people to listen to my voice, but, you know, what have you. On page 121, he begins describing the marriage of the sea itself. In the 16th century, the marriage of the sea was the carefully orchestrated apogee of state liturgy. At dawn on Ascension Day, the Doge's Cavalier in charge of ceremonial preparations determined whether the sea was calm enough for a procession of boats. If it was, he obtained the ceremonial ring, the vera, from the officials of the Raison Vesci, again, I'm terrible with pronunciations, and announced the beginning of the censa. After Mass was sung in San Marco, the Doge, high magistrates, and foreign ambassadors boarded the Bucintoro. I really hope I pronounced that correctly. The Doge's ceremonial galley decorated with figures of justice and the insignia of the Republic. As they were rowed out onto the lagoon, the chapel choir of San Marco sang motets, and the bells of the churches and monasteries under the patronage of the Doge began ringing. At the convent of St. Elena, the Patriarch of Castello and his flatboat, Piatto, bedecked with banners, joined the procession of vessels, which usually included thousands of gaily adorned private gondolas, barges hired by the guilds, pilot boats fitted out with companies of young noblemen, and galleys manned by sailors of the arsenal. Now, the Doge would eventually reach the actual mouth of the lagoon. Again, if you don't know anything about the physical geography of Venice, It's situated. The city of Venice is situated on a small series of islands in the interior of a lagoon that would eventually reach the mouth of the Adriatic. Whenever the Doge would reach the mouth of the actual Adriatic, he would say a psalm, utter a specific utterance, and then drop the ring into the Adriatic. And what this ritual meant was that the Doge was essentially marrying the sea. And this is an important action because by dropping the ring, the Doge is making a symbolic gesture that Venice was married to the sea and therefore ultimately would receive all the benefits of being married to the sea. And this is a really, really interesting ritual. Like, as much as I just, it's so, oh, it's so cool. I'm sorry. No, I'm not sorry. It's just really awesome. It makes me nerd out. The concept of this idea of our economic success, the reason we're so good at trade, the reason we're able to establish this thalassocracy, the reason we're able to have all of these merchant positions across the Mediterranean, the reason we are so successful is because we are symbolically and in all essence practically married to the Mediterranean Sea. Like, that's the key to our success. And so Muir is taking this civic ritual, which is imbued with tons of religious significance, in order to demonstrate to his reader that this was a way Venice was able to sort of philosophically justify their success. And he notes on page 131, let's go straight to the quote itself. Let's see. Here we go. On page 131 he says, "The marriage of the sea was a Venetian version of a spring fertility festival. The usual goals of agrarian fertility rites, safeguarding the fecundity of women and crops, were transformed by Venetian rites to serve maritime and mercantile needs. The rites ensured the safety of sailors at sea, expressed political and commercial hegemony, established a trade fair for the crowds, and invoked through a mystical marriage continued prosperity. At the moment of their occurrence, such fertility rites characteristically contribute to social cohesion and unanimity within the community." Now, looking at that quote, one is able to observe sort of a wider historical trend at this point, because he's observing that the marriage of the sea, if you really look at it, was often a kind of fertility ritual. Again, fertility as a symbolic idea is ultimately success. Biologically speaking, one is successful if one is able to pass along one's DNA, because that is the key to survival. In terms of in terms of human fertility rituals were usually an effort to ensure the success of crops, which in turn would be continuance of life, which would then allow one comfort as well as the opportunity to pass along one's DNA. Now, things, as always with human beings, get complicated as sort of civilization grows, as develops, as we develop language, as we develop cultures, we develop religions, we develop philosophy, what have you. Those fertility rituals wouldn't necessarily go away. In fact, Weir is kind of commenting that the marriage of the sea demonstrates a new complexity of the fertility ritual. La Serenissima spread across the Mediterranean for 1,000 years. I'm going to keep saying that over and over again, but that's the key there. They were successful. They were propagating their prosperity. They were enjoying their prosperity. But as Muir points out, that prosperity is specifically because they continued this ritual. And the marriage of the sea, just for the record, is still going on. Now, technically, Venice is part of the modern nation state of Italy. It's not an autonomous, independent republic the way it was before. Nevertheless, the ritual still continues because it has helped establish and compartmentalize Venice as an idea in and of itself. Again, I said at the start, this is kind of difficult because with the last book, we were dealing with the conception of Cleopatra and the actual historical record of Cleopatra. Or when we talked about Thermopylae, we were talking about, the sort of wider conversation about the 300 Spartans. But we also had the actual physical 300 Spartans, their record to talk about it. And with 1453, we had Ottoman and Byzantine records. We had a solid historical document. Muir's book is different than the last three because it's addressing far more of an abstract idea, which is that how are the Venetians crafting this notion that they are better, that they are sort of a chosen people, that they deserve the prosperity. Because again, if you look at them, no other nation or no other city-state during the Renaissance had this sort of complex identity. You had nation-states like Florence who were incredibly successful in the textile industry, and they would lead military operations and had political dynasty issues. But again, their government didn't last the way Venice's did. Again, I talked about you have Normans in Sicily and the south of Italy who achieved tremendous, wonderful, amazing things, but ultimately they too were swept away as new powers entered into the scene. Again, Muir's trying to tackle this abstract idea that because Venetians crafted a personal identity that was wrapped around their success, and because these civic rituals were mixed in with religion too, there was this abstract quality to Venice that the citizens of Venice compartmentalized and allowed them to feel that even the smallest civilian had some capacity for greatness. And that is a really interesting idea. It's just that in terms of a history itself, it's a little difficult to access if it's difficult to it's difficult. Right here, my difficulty in terms of expressing or sort of analyzing this, I think, speaks to the heart of this issue. Muir's book is difficult because it's not addressing just one aspect of the historical record. It's not even just trying to access the actual historical record of Venice. It's trying to tackle the history of the idea of Venice as it has manifested. And again, I noted before when I was talking about his methodology as an academic writer, he does a good job of saying, this is what we're going to talk about. So, the Feast of Marys, the conception of St. Mark, the conception of the Doge, the coronation of the Doge. These are all rituals and aspects of the Venetian identity that he explores in this book. And for every ritual, he tries to understand how did the Venetians themselves think about this. And he does a good job of providing lots of evidence, but at the same time, for a reader who may not have a lot of background in the Republic of Venice, which I will admit, as much as I love blues videos and as much as I do know about the history of Renaissance Italy, even I have to admit there's a great amount about Renaissance history that I don't know. But, my ignorance aside, there still is a lot of really interesting ideas in Muir's book. And while we're talking about the marriage of the sea, I did want to address one aspect of it that I find really fascinating. Now, I've addressed, as always at the start of this, that I am the fuzzy gay history enthusiast, because I am pansexual, identify as gay for the most part, but while I tend to read a lot about gay male identity, I also am, without a doubt, an unapologetic feminist, and I've read a great number of texts which explore the feminist philosophy and idea. And if you pay attention in The Marriage of the Sea, Muir has an interesting sort of feminist argument, or at least maybe I should say maybe a feminist observation, because I don't know if I can honestly say that Muir is a feminist in and of himself. But he says on page 132 of the book, talking about the marriage of the sea as a ritual, the Sensa also deprived the sea of its frightening demeanor by feminizing it. The men who sailed abroad could most easily imagine the sea as a female archetype, unpredictable, fickle, sometimes violent, other times passive, but assuredly she could be mastered by the resolute male. Again, when we talked about Cleopatra, we discussed this a little bit, throughout human history, again, anything that is seen as violent or treacherous or fickle or just violent, period, is often associated with female traits. This is just one of these just recurring patterns because we've constantly lived in patriarchal societies. Women have gotten just the raw end of this rhetoric. It's changing, I think, but ever so steadily. But if you look at that, he's observing that through this ritual, there's sort of an implied misogyny. Again, because the Mediterranean posed a direct threat to the lives of sailors, who of course were male, no woman would go out on the sea. Lord forbid women should, be autonomous individuals and do jobs. But because the sea was treacherous and could cost the life of a sailor, it was observed to have feminine traits. And so implied in the civic ritual is a kind of misogynistic element to it, because he continues by saying, The Sensa revealed two profound psychological habits of belief: that natural forces could be comprehended by personifying them, and that through understanding these forces one could better control them, or at least predict their influences. And in symbolizing sexual conquest, the processional movement took full advantage of the female metaphor. Through the marriage each year at the beginning of the sailing season, and through the subsequent voyages that consummated the union, the sea was deprived of her mystery. Men now, quote, knew her. And that's on page 133. So if you look at this, he's tying back into this idea of a fertility ritual by demonstrating that the marriage of the sea was not just a sort of political gesture in order to demonstrate Venice's political authority, its military might, because again, if you don't know anything about the history of Venice, they had a shipyard known as La Arsenal, which could literally manufacture a ship in the day. Venice was very much a mercantile operation, but it could also be a military operation when it wanted to. Now, that gets, of course, into the military use of mercenaries during the Renaissance, but again, that in itself is its own conversation when I talk about Machiavelli at some point. I do intend to talk about him, by the way. When we talk about that, we'll discuss mercenaries, what have you. But Venice was very much a military organization, economic organization. They possessed a great amount of power. But again, they were still driven as human beings to perform some manner of fertility ritual as well as a justification for their own sort of, quote, fertile success. And so if you look at that, I think Muir is really successful in demonstrating that what is implied in this ritual is a lot of embedded misogyny. And so I guess the question then becomes, so what? Well, it's an important thing to talk about because, again, if we're talking about a fertility ritual, you can observe that, again, the power structure is firmly rooted in male hands who are then using symbolic gestures to justify sort of male authority over feminine forces in the world. Now, I'm going to leave the feminists to sort of come up with a lasting significance of that myself, because they can do it a lot better than I can, and the last thing they need is yet another in a long line of privileged white men mansplaining. But I did want to read that quote because I do think it's really valuable to talk about, to sort of discuss the idea of rituals as a kind of masculine gesture. Again, Venice was extraordinarily successful politically, economically, socially, what have you. And so you have in this kind of, I'll say modernized, at least in terms of Renaissance modern, you have the sort of modernized fertility ritual taking place that's being compartmentalized into a person's identity, into a sense of self. And again, I think the issue I'm having as I'm talking about Muir's book is because there's just so much abstract qualities to this book and to this argument itself. Again, it's not just a straight history. He is talking about actual rituals like the abduction of the body of Saint Mark and the coronation of the Doge and sort of the governmental structure of Venice, but at the same time, because he's not focusing specifically on one independent doge, or one action by the Republic of Venice, or one maybe economic strategy of it, it sometimes can be difficult for a reader to just land on one sort of solid footing. Discussion of the abstract is abstract, and it's difficult because a lot of times if you don't have the educational background, if you don't have all the facts working behind you, sometimes reading or talking about it is not only obnoxious, it can be, well, boring. And so I would argue that Muir's book will probably suffer to the reader who doesn't have a lot of background in these sort of issues and topics. But at the same time, I won't say the book isn't worth it. Again, there were long passages where I didn't necessarily struggle with it, but I did feel that he was just sort of going on and on, citing this researcher and this quote, or this researcher, or this writer, or this political individual, without giving too much of a background behind them. But at the same time, the way he was able to execute his analysis, I still never felt that this book was completely irrelevant. Muir does an interesting job of demonstrating how civic rituals impacted the Venetian society, and then sort of creates this implication where the reader then has to understand, do civic rituals in our own times still have lasting significance? And I guess I wanted to sort of end my quotes here on this page, on page 301, when he talks a little bit more. By this point, he's sort of addressed his conclusion. He's given all the examples that he wants to give, and so he's trying to find a final so what statement. And on page 301, he notes Renaissance Venetians did not repudiate their medieval ritual past, but magnified it. In the hands of the governing patricians who advocated a more powerfully centralized city, the myth of civic freedom and the cult of St. Mark were magnets to attract parochial sentiment. Although the precise origins of the Venetians' belief in their city's birth as an independent community and in the special patronage of St. Mark are lost in the dark centuries before the end of the first Christian millennium, the idea of a free city under divine protection was so enticing that it survived even the death of the Republic. In contrast to the belief that modernity brought a decline in ritual and an occupying loss of communal unity, the evidence from Venice indicates that the oligarchic regime pursued the supposedly modern goals of centralization, bureaucratic growth, and increased social control through the sophisticated manipulation of ritual and ceremonial forms and the elaboration of popular myths. The city of Venice, if you remember, again, the timeline that I set, it supposedly is started around the year 697. However, some people attribute it a little bit early to the year 421. I'm kind of on the fence on this one. I feel like 697 is probably a more accurate and appropriate date because it was about that time that Rome, as a republic, was beginning to implode. Now, Rome had been sacked twice, but the problem is a lot of people like to take the narrative approach of once Rome was sacked, that was the end of Rome. Now, I'm going to talk about this in a later book. I've actually recently begun auditing a graduate level history course, which is entirely about the medieval period. So expect a fair number of books in next coming videos, podcasts, what have you, about that. But one of the things I'm beginning to learn really quickly is that the narrative that Rome fell is a very dramatic black and white vision. It's not just necessarily that Rome fell, it's more to the idea that Rome began to implode and crumble. And the problem with that aspect is not just it put the world into chaos. In a lot of places, it most certainly did. I'm not denying that the implosion of the Roman Empire was free of consequence. But realistically, and sort of more and more I'm learning the historical perspective, is that as Rome began to implode, what was established was a kind of power vacuum. So what took place then was more and more people had to rely upon self-reliance or find a new power structure. And especially in terms of the Western civilization, you begin to see more and more barbarian peoples sort of rising to the occasion, filling that power vacuum, establishing the foundations of what would eventually become a lot of the new nation states. And so if you look, especially in the region of Italy, which is the center of the Roman Empire, with the implosion of Rome, people needed something new. Rome provided a lot of structure in terms of bureaucracy, in terms of economics, in terms of politics. Again, if you live in any kind of well-established government, while it is not necessarily entertaining or dramatic, bureaucracy matters because it provides a stable foundation for people to live their lives. You may not like the DMV, but the fact that the DMV exists ensures that there are going to be people who have driver's license who are allowed to be on the road. You may not necessarily like that your taxes go to pay other projects that you may not like, but your taxes go to pay for roads, your taxes go to pay for bridges, for a police force, for a fire department, what have you. Those basic aspects of administration provide stability. So what Muir's trying to talk about, or trying to suggest here, is that these cultural rituals helped establish the idea of Venice as a serene republic, which, if you look at those two words together, I think is absolutely everything. Again, a republic is this idea where everyone has the right to say, or everyone has a right to have an opinion about the way government and power should be executed. And in terms of serenity, this idea that this is not going to be a chaotic quality. Instead, it is going to be a successful, calm reality that people are going to gravitate towards. And so I think Muir then is finally able to make this really interesting idea that in the power vacuum after the implosion of the Roman Empire, the structure or the establishment of La Serenissima was not just, just the sort of hodgepodge and luck. In fact, it was a very brilliantly executed attempt to create a new idea for what power should be, how it should be executed, and then how to live. And I just think that's really cool and really fascinating. And so while there may be an abstract quality to all of this, Muir is able to demonstrate in the end why these civic rituals possessed the power that they did, why they possessed the relevance that they did to Venetians, and then what were the lasting cultural impacts of that. And so, my final summation of this book is, while there are a lot of issues with his executions, and while there are a lot of references that sometimes will go over the reader's head, and it is painfully academic, Muir's book addresses a really important idea of how people were able to bounce back from the implosion of Rome, how the citizens of Venice were able to craft an idea of themselves as not only special, but unique and important, and how civic rituals, period, are a means by which human beings are able to create a conception of themselves that can not only be positive, but in fact can transcend our individual selves and last for centuries. So that's the book itself. I wanted to talk just a little bit about the methodology itself, because I said before, this is a very academic book, but this book surpasses any of my expectations, because in the back of the book, Muir has 32 pages of bibliography. Let me say that again. 32 pages of bibliography. But not only that, he has biographies. That's right. He has a first bibliography. Did I say biography? He has a first bibliography dedicated solely to primary sources. And if you don't know what a primary source is, if you've ever taken any sort of high school history course or English course or even college level history or English course, you've probably been asked to get primary sources and secondary. A primary source is sort of the original source. So in the example of poetry, say Ozymandias is a primary source. An article published by a scholar of Shelley would be a secondary source. So Muir dedicates an entire bibliography just to the primary sources he's using about the Republic of Venice, and then he provides secondary sources that, in terms of the time at which this book were written, is it's an incredible distribution. It's not simply just books. He also provides numerous academic articles, and they're spread over a wide period. Muir, whatever I say about his writing, whatever I say about his methodology, what cannot be denied is that Muir did his research, and he did a damn good job of it as well. There are literally pages in this book that are just half a page, or almost 90% of a page, can be footnotes alone. Just references that he's employing to justify his argument. And so whatever you say about Muir himself, he is a damn good academic writer. He is a damn good academic, period. He knows exactly what he's trying to do in terms of crafting an argument, but more importantly, substantiating an argument, which is exactly what you would want, not only just from an academic historian, but just from any historian, period. And then finally, my favorite part, the index. So, Muir's index is pretty good. I mean, it's extraordinarily functional. He gives me absolutely everything I would want, but I didn't pay as much attention to this index as I did in the previous books, largely because I was often sort of stumped by his sources. Because he is referencing academics, and because he's referencing doges, and because he's referencing contemporaries of the period, it's a little difficult at times to sort of really latch on to sort of names and concepts. I was able to find the material whenever I needed to go back and look for it, that I did, and several of the references in his indexes are very well executed. So if you look at the Basilica of San Marco, one day. So you like Basilica of San Marco of 16132, antecedents to burning of decorations of Doge's authority over litanies and peace made at blah 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 blah. This is a very well executed index. Again, looking at this book, I'm far more impressed by the fact that he was able to put, again, 32 pages of bibliography. Like, I had a 5-page bibliography in graduate school that I thought was damn impressive. Muir just puts me to shame. I can't say enough about it. It's a phenomenal book. And so, it's sort of, I guess, my final so what point here. I've said it numerous times already. Muir's book is a history of ideas. And that is a difficult concept to work with. It's a difficult concept to sort of talk about, because the immediate significance of it does not necessarily feel relevant. But as I talked a little bit about in The Marriage of the Sea, about how he made the argument that it was a fertility ritual, again, Muir's book is trying to capture or examine a timelessness in humanities. Human beings are an ego-driven species. We're a symbol-driven species. We like repetition. We like taking things and making them into sort of embodiments of something else. A glass of water is not just a glass of water. It could be a symbol about my marriage. It could be a symbol about my depression. It could be a symbol about what have you. And so Muir's trying to create a history about how human beings make symbols, how those symbols can be complex, how those symbols can inform identity. And that's really, really difficult, especially if you don't know anything about Venice. But like I said, I still feel that this book is really relevant to talk about. I knew as soon as I finished reading it that I wanted to do a podcast about it because while it is an extraordinarily academic book, it still is I would argue, is still a fairly readable book. There are numerous passages that will leave the reader stumped, I'm sure, like it left me stumped. But it's still an important contribution, not only to the study of human ritual, but then also to the study of Venice, period. And gosh, man, again, as a kid who grew up playing Assassin's Creed 2, as somebody who's watched overly sarcastic reviews of Venice somewhere around 10, 13, 14 times now, Muir's book was a fascinating contribution to those studies. All right. I think I'm going to leave it there. Thank you, as always, so much, whoever you are, wherever you are, for listening to me. I really appreciate it. Like I said before, I'm definitely going to put some links to Blue's review of Venice, or review videos about Venice, in the description section as well. I'm also definitely going to post a link to Amazon where you can get a copy of Muir's book. Technically, the book was published by the University of Princeton, the Princeton University Press. They also have a site where you can purchase the book. However, directly from Princeton University Press, the book's going to be about $50 or $60. I would definitely recommend go through Amazon if you want to purchase it. You can also find a copy of it on Google Books as well. I might try to post that. I'm also going to post a link to Edward Muir's faculty page on Northeastern University's website, because Muir himself is really fascinating. He's written dozens of academic articles and books about culture in Renaissance Venice. He's just an awesome dude. I can't wait to read more about him. I'm also going to post a link simply to the Wikipedia page of the Republic of Venice. I have undergone a massive sort of, revolutionary retake in terms of my perspective about what Wikipedia is. It's really not that bad. If you use it solely as your means of research, then yeah, you're an idiot. What you do, you go to Wikipedia, and then you go to the reference pages and their bibliography page. And then once you've done that, that's where you begin. And then finally, in terms of just Venice as a worthwhile history, Muir's book is a great, wonderful, fantastic book, but it is absolutely the wrong place to hop into the history of Venice. I consulted with one of my former history professors about this, and he recommended that the go-to text, still considered widely one of the best books about not just La Serenissima, but just Venice as a city and just as a political... The history of Venice, you're going to want to read Venice, a Maritime Republic by Frederick C. Lane. And I'll definitely go ahead and post a link to that book as well. I haven't gotten a chance to read it because, again, I just decided to hop directly into a graduate level history course about medieval Europe. And then I'm also listening to Ron Chernow's Grant, which I plan at some point doing a podcast about that one too. I might have to break that up into two places. And then, of course, I promised last time that I would do at some point a review about something super gay. I can only hope, right? The inner fairies in me are like, come on, where is the podcast about gay sex? Come on. Why have we not talked about that yet? So I'll have to take care of him at some point too. But as always, thank you for listening. I really appreciate it. Have a good one.